Welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been discussing civil rights, and I wanted to briefly mention an issue that could give rise to a kind of civil rights claim, just to illustrate how these things happen and how really civil rights should be understood as a backstop for civil liberties. When you think about at the Biden or at the Harris-Trump debate, Trump said that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio are eating cats, eating the dogs. And he has subsequently said at rallies that he wants to evacuate. He wants to, basically take these Haitian immigrants and get them out of Springfield, Ohio. I think you can understand from a tactical perspective why Trump is making these kinds of claims. He is clearly running as a nativist candidate. He is sort of an America for Americans kind of guy. And that sort of appeal certainly resonates with certain categories of Americans whose votes he needs very badly. And there are a lot of Americans who respond to those kinds of appeals. The problem for Trump and for people who want to get all, kind of recent immigrants out of the country, the people that are living in Haiti are, in fact, naturalized citizens. These are people who have gone through the immigration process and earned their citizenship. They came to Springfield because Springfield had a desperate need for workers. And so, first and foremost, just grabbing up people and taking them from their homes would constitute almost certainly a civil rights violation. And so, again, the problem that we confront in our politics is that our politics often seems to be creating these instances where people feel empowered to say, I'm going to do something to a group of people that our Constitution simply does not allow. And so we should understand that civil rights exist because we have not always been perfect in our protections of people's civil liberties, that certain categories of people have on various occasions, historically and even in the present, had their civil liberties systematically violated. And so we're going to continue talking about the civil rights movement leading into the 1960s. And then we're going to discuss how civil rights were extended to other groups. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that really resonate on the civil rights level in our politics today. So civil rights has been extended to other groups. First and foremost, of course, we talked about the civil rights movement of African Americans that began really in the 1930s, but really kind of began coming to fruition in the 1960s with the passage, with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954, and then subsequent decisions, Brown 2, where the state officials in the South went to the court and said, we need more time. And they were asked how much more time they needed. Well, 20 years. And the court basically held, no, that's too long. You must integrate your schools with all deliberate speed. And that, of course, created the kind of vagueness, and that created more opportunities for southern states to engage in obstructionist behavior. You also get the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, subsequent legislation that again attacked this idea of states' rights to discriminate against people on the basis of arbitrary features of their existence. And of course, this caused the Supreme Court to adopt what is known as the strict scrutiny standard of jurisprudence, which basically says that laws that make distinctions based on arbitrary features of people's existence, i.e. the color of their skin, are subject to strict scrutiny. In other words, they are automatically presumed to be unconstitutional on their face. And that shifts the burden of proof from the plaintiff to, in this instance, which would be civil rights groups or Black Americans, onto the state to say, you have to demonstrate that you have a non-invidious reason for making this kind of a law that singles out groups of people. So the women's rights movement has a very venerable history, and of course it reflects this reality that women have historically been subordinated, that they have been subjected to consistent discrimination. Now, oftentimes it was kind of a gentle, placing of women on a pedestal, saying you're too delicate to deal with such harsh realities as politics. Women have consistently bridled at that kind of patronizing and that kind of patrimonial approach to politics. And so you have had distinctive waves of women's civil rights movements, beginning really in the 19th century, well, the late 18th and 19th century, where again, women, politics began opening up to the point where it would admit women to make these kinds of arguments. Of course, there were women at the time of the ratification of the Constitution that advocated for women's rights. John Adams' wife, while Adams was serving as minister to England at the time of the Constitutional Convention, wrote to her husband and said, you should make sure that the Constitutional Convention acknowledges the rights of women. And Adams, in his letter replying, I cannot but laugh. Not because he did not love his wife and respect her, but because he just didn't think that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were prepared to go to that extent. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, there was really only one state that allowed women to vote in federal elections, and that was the state of New Jersey. And New Jersey subsequently revoked that right shortly thereafter. Another important aspect of women's political subordination was the idea of coverture, which basically meant that all property that a woman owned when she entered into marriage with her husband shifted to her husband. Her husband had rights over her property, over any kind of cash, a dowry, a home, property. That was automatically assumed to be the property of the husband upon marriage. That was something that oftentimes women looked at as a form of leverage, that this was, having a large dowry, for example, made you a more eligible, potential bride. And so, again, that reflects the sense in which women were objects, and women were primarily defined legally in relation to men as daughters, subsequently as wives, as mothers. These were how women were viewed from a legal perspective. There were feminist writings going into the 19th century. Of course, one that I'm most familiar with is John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, which he wrote with a woman by the name of Harriet Taylor, who was a feminist and who he had a very close relationship with. And again, he made the argument from a distinctly liberal perspective that women must be presumed to have the same reasoning capacities and the same rights as men. He utterly demolished this idea that women were mentally weak and that they were not capable, not strong enough emotionally, that they were over-emotional. He destroyed all those arguments and basically pointed to instances where men demonstrated weakness in reasoning, where men demonstrated that they were emotional in their approach to politics. In the United States, one of the most significant events that kind of opened the door to more organized feminist civil rights movements was the Seneca Falls Convention, which occurred in 1848, which, by the way, was a momentous year in history. That was the year when you had a series of revolutions throughout Europe, largely as a result of the failure of the Peace of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars, to provide an adequate political foundation for many of the countries of Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The Seneca Falls Convention adopted what were known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically said that women must have equal rights. They must have the idea that they could divorce a husband who was abusive or who was unable to provide for the family. They advocated the idea of no-fault divorce. They advocated, I believe, for the vote, but that even the male members of the convention were not prepared to go that far. In 1970s, you saw the Organization for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which claimed over 2 million members. And of course, by 1917, women suffragettes had been agitating for equal rights and for the vote for a very long time. 2 years later, or 3 years later, in 1920, of course, they finally got the 19th Amendment ratified, which again is landmark because again it enfranchises fully half of the adult population of the United States. I mean, that is a massive expansion of the franchise, and again, one of the most significant revisions of our Constitution in our history. And of course, again, the problem, of course, is that voting rights for women and for blacks generally were still suppressed in the South, and it would take another 45 years to gain the right to vote for black men and women living in the states of the former Confederacy and a few others. Ending gender discrimination, of course, the Civil Rights Act. Ironically, in the passage in the legislative history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Republican actually attempted to, what some people thought, institute a poison pill into the Civil Rights Act by saying, well, let's just give women civil rights as well. Many of the men in the audience laughed, but there was a woman in Congress at the time, and she said, yes, let's do that. And the sponsor actually, said that he believed it, that he believed his wife had a right to equal rights. And so it's important to keep in mind when you look at civil rights and when you look at civil liberties broadly, the Supreme Court plays a decisive role in how civil liberties will be interpreted and in the scope and extent to which civil rights claims can be pressed. The Supreme Court had determined in the early 20th century that gender represented a protected class. This dealt with the rights of women working in sewing in sweatshops and places like that. There was another area that Louis Brandeis, they called them Brandeis briefs, where again he was making the argument that women should not be compelled to work in such conditions. In doing so, again, in a very patronizing way. The court has declined to extend strict scrutiny to instances where gender is treated differently. That is they call that the rational basis test, where again there is a heightened standard and where the state has to provide some kind of rationale, but it's not automatically presumed to be unconstitutional on its face. Equality in education and employment. Title IX of the Civil Rights Act is very important. Courts have issued orders for major universities to add more women's sports programs. With sports in college athletics, of course, the 900-pound gorilla is college football. Sports teams keep, I think, over 100 athletes on scholarship. And so there is no analog to football in women's sports. So the argument has been that you have to add, women's tennis, women's volleyball, women's golfing, women's softball, everywhere where there is a kind of an analogous sport. And so they oftentimes hold football to be in a separate class, but they nevertheless have been responsive to lawsuits saying that women have a right to equal opportunities as it relates to college athletics. Because it's important to keep in mind, sport scholarships are a valuable avenue for lower income Americans to get a college education. You had the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Again, despite that law, women's pay has only slowly approached parity with men. Pay equity has remained elusive for black women and Latinas and other minorities, not accepting Asian American women. One thing, when you look, for example, at the WNBA, the argument has always been, why aren't women paid more? And typically a market or argument is typically forwarded. They're saying basically, look, if you guys can fill stadiums, if you guys can get large TV contracts, then you can get paid more. And a lot of women's, especially the WNBA, a lot of interest has been sparked by Caitlin Clark because she is such a generational talent. She's already set scoring and assist records for rookie players. And interestingly, in games where the Indiana team plays, the ticket sales spike. Television gets a lot larger audience, and so I think that is an enormous moment for the WNBA because they are actually meeting that claim in that they are creating a market, and women in the NBA should be very grateful to Caitlin Clark and to Angel Reese and some of the other rookie players who have increased interest in women's basketball. Sexual harassment and the Me Too movement has also again marked an important social movement in the kind of the pursuit of women's civil rights. Again, the origin of sexual harassment lies in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The court's finding has, basically, they have identified two forms of sexual harassment. The first one is what we know, what are known as quid pro quo arrangements, and quid pro quo is Latin for this for that. It's basically the conversion of sex into a transaction, where a male supervisor would make an explicit or implicit threat that submission to sexual advances is a condition of continued employment or advancement. That is, on its face, anything where somebody who has authority over another person and says, if you'll go out on a date with me, I will accede to your salary demands. That is a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The second form of harassment involves the creation of an offensive or intimidating work environment, which amounts to what the court characterizes as a hostile work environment. And again, you see this, for example, in occupations that are predominantly male-oriented, where, for example, you're talking about, say, a tire shop where they replace tires on cars, and there happens to be a woman who is working there, and the men don't change their behavior and continue talking about sex, make objectifying comments about that one woman worker in the bay. That would be considered cultivating a hostile work environment, where again, the woman might be able to manage it, but why should she have to? Right? Some women are very good at being in male-dominated environments, and they just suck it up and they get through it. That doesn't mean they should have to, right? Women shouldn't have to, develop a thick skin around men. Men should know to behave appropriately. Sexual assault and harassment in higher education. The Obama administration's Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, issued a letter later in his administration, I think it was around 2014, advising stricter policies on sexual assault and harassment. And this actually revolved around a situation where there were allegations that a woman had been abused by some athletes at Duke University. Now this does raise significant due process challenges because, again, on the one hand, you want to hold people accountable. You want to hold men accountable when they engage in sexual assault or sexual harassment, especially in particular sexual assault. Rape should not be condoned under any circumstances. At the same time, universities have oftentimes created environments that create due process challenges. For example, allowing a woman to keep their identity concealed when a male student is accused of sexual assault creates an environment where, again, the defendant doesn't have the ability to confront their accuser and challenge the veracity of the accusation. As horrible as it is for a woman to be subjected to sexual assault, it's pretty darn bad for a male student to be wrongfully accused. And so due process of law requires that we manage these kinds of situations in ways that respects both the rights and the sensibilities of the victim, but also the due process rights of the person accused. The reason that so many of the amendments to the Bill of Rights deal with due process of criminally accused people suggests that our Constitution is supposed to protect those kinds of situations and to make sure that everyone involved has constitutional rights that are respected by legal bodies adjudicating those kinds of challenges. The Trump administration's Department of Education Office of Civil Rights basically reversed Obama's policy and strengthened the due process rights of the accused. I believe the Biden administration has gone back to the previous Obama approach to sexual assault and sexual harassment. Latinos, I think it's important to keep in mind that Latinos reflect a wide range of groups, cultures, national origins that are, again, captured in the idea of Hispanic or Latino. But the reality is that where an Hispanic person comes from, also racial composition. Many Cubans that came to America are also African, in terms of having very dark skin. There are lots and lots of indigenous peoples in Central America, and a lot of people that we would characterize as mulatto. And racial discrimination oftentimes does exist within the Latin community. So it's important to recognize that the Latin American community is not monolithic. The civil rights experience for Latinos has varied considerably by group and place. Of course, Mexican Americans are the dominant Hispanic group, and so their civil rights experiences tend to be the most emphasized. Of course, Cesar Chavez really was one of the first big civil rights icons within the Latino civil rights movement. He was sort of the leader of fruit pickers in California and Arizona and New Mexico. And fruit pickers in those days were treated really quite badly. They were forced to work long hours. They weren't given access to water. They weren't given access to breaks. And when you're working in the summer when it's 100 degrees, people can drop dead from heat exhaustion in those kinds of circumstances. And they oftentimes were overseen by, really, thuggish people who, again, were more interested in, keeping productivity high rather than respecting people's rights. The League of Latin American Citizens, LULAC, is a major, again, kind of analog to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They won a major victory in Hernandez versus Texas in 1954, where the Supreme Court ruled that Mexican Americans and people of other nationalities were entitled to equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. This is an enormously important decision because it also reflects the reality, and I believe it was the original intent of the drafters of the Constitution, that all inhabitants within the American, within the United States of America, were protected by the same constitutional rights as citizens. Now, they didn't have a right to vote. They didn't have a right to certain other emoluments that come with citizenship, but they did have a right to be treated equally under the law. So Latinos have pursued sort of a three-track political strategy. First, Latinos have pursued the traditional path of voter registration and voting rights along ethnic lines, led by groups like La Raza Unida, which again is the People United. The second track is a legal strategy using civil rights laws to end racial discrimination. A key group using that second track is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the MALDEF. And a third strategy is, again, mass mobilizations with Latinos taking to the streets to protest. 2006 street protests against anti-immigration legislation illustrates the power of mass protests. Now, all that being said, in several very critical states, Hispanic turnout tends to be far lower than we know their potential voting strength is. Certainly, we know that in Texas and in Arizona and in New Mexico. In New Mexico, they are beginning to exert their electoral influence. In part, again, keep in mind, when New Mexico entered the Union, it was a minority state. There were a majority of Hispanic Americans, people who had been there, prior to New Mexico even becoming a territory. That New Mexico came to statehood around the same time as Oklahoma is a reflection of that reality. Part of the reason why Oklahoma Territory took so long to become a state was that was the place where Native Americans from the eastern United States had been forced to move. And so it was a very large percentage of the population that were Native Americans. And frankly, again, there was this reluctance among white Americans to give statehoods to states where there was a possibility that a majority of those states' inhabitants were not white. Asian Americans, like Latin Americans, are not a monolith. Again, in the current United States, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Indian Americans, that there are, I think I said Korean Americans, Filipino Americans. There's a large percentage. Now, a bulk of those tend to be Chinese and Japanese, and that has to do a lot with, the fact of the Chinese coming over in large numbers to build the western half of the Intercontinental Railroad. Chinese faced discrimination on the West Coast that was very similar to the kind of discrimination that Hispanics faced in the Southwest. They were routinely denied access to citizenship. They were routinely denied, access to the things that they had built. They would build communities, and angry white mobs would burn them down. The first federal immigration legislation in 1882 was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, it was racist. The racism was written into the title of the law. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed because Chinese cobblers, Chinese shoemakers were brought into Massachusetts to break a shoemakers strike. There was a shoemakers union in Massachusetts, and they struck for better working conditions. And the management of those shoe factories brought in skilled Chinese labor, and so that act of using foreigners to break a strike so infuriated Americans that they basically passed laws denying the right of Chinese to come into the country. They're basically arguing there are too many Chinese in the country already. If that sounds familiar to you, that this is a recrudescence of that kind of nativist rhetoric that we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Japanese Americans confronted very similar discrimination. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, made the fateful decision to intern Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Several hundred thousand Japanese Americans were summarily rounded up. They lost their homes. In many instances, they lost businesses due to their long confinement. You had a symbolic atonement for that patent violation of Japanese American civil liberties in the Civil Rights Act of 1988. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court has basically been okay with anti-immigrant jurisprudence, from the late 19th century forward. In Ozawa versus the United States, the court ruled that because people of Japanese descent were not white, they were ineligible for citizenship. Similarly, in 1923, the court ruled in United States versus Bhagat Song Thind that because Thind was of Indian descent, was therefore ineligible for naturalization and could not become a U.S. citizen. Finally, the Supreme Court held that Japanese internment was constitutional in Korematsu versus the United States. The Korematsu decision was not formally overruled by the court until 2018 in Trump v. Ohio. So this is an interesting slide. It basically reflects the presence of foreign-born residents in the United States. And these are, both, I want to say, documented and undocumented immigrants. And again, when you look, you can see that there are large numbers of foreign-born residents in states on the coasts, but also including Texas. Florida, Texas, and California and New York have two of the largest influxes. And Texas and Florida in particular are subjects of particular sensitivity to Republicans. And again, I think I've mentioned before, those four states are mega states. They have large numbers of electoral college votes. And Republicans have great difficulty winning an election if they can't win at least two of those states. And they have used gerrymandering to prevent Texas and Florida from going, more purple, from becoming more competitive. And the rise of immigration. Look, in both of those states, almost 1/5 of the populations are foreign-born. And many of those folks are people who are inclined to support Democrats. And so it creates a real challenge. And again, it's one of the reasons why especially Florida and Texas's Governor Greg Abbott and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis have been in a fight to try and keep foreign immigration from coming into their states. Abbott went to the extent of actually putting buoys, these huge buoys in the Rio Grande River, which the federal government opposed because they believed that they were health hazards. And Abbott was kind of like, yeah, that's right. We don't want these people coming in. We want to raise the costs of these folks coming in to such a point that they don't bother, that they recognize that it's a threat to their lives. Now, I would argue, and the court has found, that that kind of policy that endangers human life is in fact unconstitutional. So where do immigrants come from? I think a lot of Americans would basically be shocked to discover that 28% of immigrants are coming from Asia, that another 25% are coming from Mexico. A lot fewer undocumented immigrants coming across the border today are actually coming from Mexico. A lot larger number since 2020 are coming from Central America. But a large number also are coming from the Caribbean. And in that instance, a lot of it is coming from Haiti, because Haiti is a very poor country. They have a lot of political violence. There are gangs controlling whole neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince, which is the major city in Haiti. And so it's a terrible situation, a lot of economic deprivation, a lot of violence. And so that is driving a lot of people coming to the United States. And the United States has allowed a large number of those people in. And again, it's important to keep in mind that, you know, those folks in Springfield, Ohio are just those kind of people. So do immigrants help the economy? And the answer is yes, they are good for the economy. Yes, the number of people coming in to Springfield, Ohio present challenges to the local government. But the mayor, who's a Republican of Springfield, Ohio, would tell you, I'd rather have people filling jobs than entire sectors of downtown shutting down because we don't have enough people working. 20% of Fortune 500 CEOs are immigrants. 10% of Americans work for a private company that is owned by an immigrant. I actually worked in a sandwich shop when I was in graduate school, and that sandwich shop was owned by an Indian guy, and he was, he ran a tight ship, but he was providing jobs for people. He had two of these kind of deli shops that he, kept people employed. What kinds of education do immigrants get? They get bachelor's degrees. Almost 17% of immigrants have bachelor's degrees. 13.4% have postgraduate degrees. A lot of times the rhetoric surrounding immigration, Trump said when he was president, we want people that are going to contribute to the economy. We want people with doctorates. We want people that are scientists, people that have skills that will help us, skills that will help us innovate in the economy. The reality is that our immigration policies already do that. It's a lot easier for people to come to this country if they have degrees, and it's easier for them to stay if they have degrees and are making valuable contributions to their communities. But the reality is that we need immigration because we have relatively low birth rates in the United States. So what is the legal status of immigrants? 45% of immigrants are naturalized citizens. That means they have gone through the process and done what they needed to do. 27% are immigrants who are lawful permanent residents. They've gone through the process. They are gainfully employed. They have long-term visas because they have demonstrated their worth to their communities and to the United States generally. A large number, 23%, 5% are temporarily lawful. And the bulk of the temporary folks are here on student visas. They're here to come to universities, attend college, get degrees. Many of them intend to go back to their countries and work and try to improve the conditions in their country. But some of them folks are going to stay. They're going to get married here. They're going to have kids here, and they're going to want to their children to have the opportunities, the greater level of opportunities that they would have if they went back to their countries of origins. So 77% of immigrants currently residing in the United States are naturalized citizens, lawful permanent residents, or foreign nationals on temporary visas. 23% of immigrants are undocumented. Now, Trump would say that it's upwards of 25 million people. Most immigration scholars would say that it's between 12 and 17 million. That's still a lot, but we are also talking about a continent-sized country with over 340 million people. And again, many undocumented immigrants are fleeing politically and economically unstable countries in Central America and Asia. And so they are leaving, large numbers of Chinese are coming in because they don't feel like they don't like living in a surveillance state. They want to live somewhere where they have an opportunity to build a life. Some of those folks might be bad guys, right? That's why we have to be careful. As a scholar, as a political scientist, I believe we should have an immigration process that minimizes the number of people who are coming in here and who are hiding, people who are living in the shadows. That is bad for them, and it's bad for our society. Global economic gender equity. Again, if you look at this chart here on the right, it notes that the United States is 30th in gender equality. Why is the United States ranked 30th out of 156 countries on gender equality? What criteria do they use? They talk about participation in the labor force, wage equality, earned income, representation in the managerial and technical professions. That's the one that hurts us the most, because there are lots of professions that are well-paying jobs that simply are where women are strongly underrepresented. The scientific field, the STEM fields that they talk about, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Former president of Harvard, whose name escapes me, he was one of Clinton's big economic advisors. He put his foot in his mouth and said, well, maybe women just aren't that good at math, and really provoked a firestorm of controversy. Ultimately had to step down from Harvard. And again, the point being, oftentimes, math aptitude has to be caught young and has to be nurtured. Young men are oftentimes more easily identified and get that attention. But many of the skills that you're going to find in the STEM fields, need to be developed from a young age. Think from an athletic perspective. Why has the United States always struggled to get good strikers? Well, in part because being a great striker is part mix of natural talent, but it's also part of being nurtured at a young age. Lionel Messi went to Spain like when he was younger than 10, I believe, to be taught the skills that he displays today. That makes him one of the best soccer players in the world. The same, it's analogous with math and with engineering and things like that. You have to be willing to see that those skills can exist in women as well as men. One of the surprises there is the top five. Laos, the Bahamas, Burundi, Iceland, Belarus. In part, those are all small countries. And there are cultural factors that weigh in on why they score in the top five on gender equity. And it's not always because women are equally respected in those countries. They're sort of outliers. So it again raises the question. We're about to see an answer again. Will the United States ever elect a woman president? And why has a woman not been elected to date? And a big part of it has to do with our system of government, a presidential system of government, the way we operate it. It's a lot harder for women to win elections in federal elections for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. And it's much harder still to win the presidency. Kamala Harris could be the first woman president. She could be the first
black woman president. She could be the first woman of Asian heritage to be the president. She would be a lot of firsts. And again, the challenge has been, it's been really hard for a woman to win the nomination of either political party. Remember, Hillary Clinton was the first woman to be nominated by either major party to be president of the United States. And in part, it reflects the challenge that you have to have a base of support in order to run for president. And when you think about the main bases of support, governor, there haven't been a lot of women governors. Senators, there haven't been a lot of women senators. Vice presidents, there haven't been a lot of vice presidents. And Kamala Harris's status as again the first black woman to earn the nomination is reflected first and foremost in the fact that Joe Biden made her vice president. And when Biden was forced out after the June 27th horror show of a debate, he basically fulfilled his obligation. When he named her to be vice president, he was basically saying, I think she could be the next successor to me. And so in endorsing her, he greatly increased the odds that Kamala Harris could win the presidency, could win the Democratic nomination, which is that necessary first step within our contemporary American political system. Native Americans, again, we have a long history of discrimination against Native Americans. We have been schizophrenic about Native Americans for much of colonial history. Even as colonial communities would trade with Americans, with Native Americans, they oftentimes were also working to push them off of land, and oftentimes working to eradicate them. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 basically created the idea of reservations. Reservations were oftentimes the worst territories that had the least, that were the least desirable parts of territories in that period. Think about this: Native Americans did not get citizenship until 1924. And then likewise, again, the idea of the schizophrenic notion of how we treat Native Americans. In the early 20th century, we talked about killing the Indian and saving the soul, turning them into Americans, sending them to boarding schools away from their families, and then forcing them to learn, Anglo-American ways. That reflected that sense in which we were engaging in a kind of cultural genocide. And that was, I think, a horrendous civil rights abuse against Native Americans. The Wheeler-Howard Act, one of the things, again, that was important is that the Wheeler-Howard Act restored tribal rights and rights to self-governance. I think I mentioned in an earlier presentation on state and local government that Native Americans are domestic dependent nations. They are, in effect, federal citizens, distinct from the other citizens of their states. And that has been reinforced in the McGirt ruling. But the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934 basically gave tribes greater autonomy, sort of a home rule capacity that many state governors, oftentimes, like Oklahoma's governor, tend to bridle at. They tend not to like it. Red Power, there were a number of activist movements aimed at raising awareness, public awareness of discrimination. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was again designed to give greater educational opportunities to Native Americans, and again to give them greater latitude in terms of self-governance. Disabled Americans, it's important to keep in mind, again, disabled Americans have suffered from discrimination. It's I think one of Donald Trump's most disgraceful aspects of his administration was that he didn't want to be in the presence of wounded veterans who had lost limbs or had their faces disfigured by combat, saying no one wants to see that. I was raised on an Army base. I revere people who have bled for this country. I found Trump's attitude and Trump's statements about wounded veterans to be dishonorable and disgraceful. Again, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is very significant in that it also adds drug dependence and alcoholism as a form of disability. And that makes it a lot harder to fire someone simply because they have a drug or alcohol problem. You have to actually give them resources before you can terminate them. And you have to terminate them for incompetence, not merely because they're drug addicts or alcoholics. You have another important civil rights group, the Disability Rights and Education and Defense Fund, the DREDF. Again, they have worked hard to advance the interests of the disabled. The signature achievement of that group was the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And again, a big part of the Americans with Disabilities Act is the mandate to make more public spaces accessible to wheelchair-bound people and to people with other kinds of mobility disabilities. So cities have to create ramps so that people can get down, from one sidewalk to another, crossing a street. Here in Rogers State, we had to place elevators in all multi-story buildings. Again, at great cost. That was something that again was a very expensive prospect for the university. LGBTQ plus Americans are also, again, there's a long history of discrimination against people who are not heteronormal. There has been a long, line of discrimination. Again, going back to the earliest days of Christianity, where early Christians identified homosexuality as, as a sin. Again, well into the 20th century, widespread fears of the consequences of being outed kept many LGBTQ plus members in the closet, kept them hiding as somehow heterosexual. Many heterosexual men and women married and even had families because that was the expectation, but also because it offered them a kind of camouflage. The LGBTQ plus movement began in the 1960s and gathered steam following the Stonewall riots of 1969. The Stonewall Inn was a Greenwich Village watering hole, a bar that was owned by the mafia. And it was known to be both owned by the mafia and also a gay hangout. Police raided the Stonewall Inn, and the patrons of the Stonewall Inn rioted in response. They were subject to frequent rousting. This was not peculiar to New York City. There were similar kinds of contexts in many other American cities where, again, the mob would run bars. Oftentimes they would become gay bars because, again, the mafia didn't care who their patrons were. Their bars tended to reflect the sentiments of the neighborhoods that they were located in. 3 days of rioting followed, and this actually, kind of became the formative movement in the ACT UP movement, and the fact that annually now many cities hold gay pride parades. Now, I want to also say something importantly about the LGBTQ plus movement. Like Asian Americans, like Latinos, they are not a monolith. Lesbian women and gay men they may share many common causes, but they are not culturally aligned and they don't interact a lot with one another. Bisexuals are oftentimes subject to discrimination within the LGBTQ plus community. Transgender has become an important issue today that I'll talk about more in a minute. But since the 1990s, the Supreme Court has found that LGBTQ plus members enjoy civil rights protections. There was an early setback in Bowers versus Hardwick, a Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court held that a Georgia law criminalizing sodomy was constitutional. I think I mentioned this in the civil rights presentation. However, in 1996, the Supreme Court acknowledged the civil rights protections of gay and lesbian people by striking down a 1992 amendment to the Colorado Constitution, prohibiting local governments from passing ordinances protecting gay rights. Then, of course, in 2002, which again I mentioned earlier, the court reversed its earlier decision in Bowers versus Hardwick, extending the constitutional right to privacy to members of the LGBTQ plus community. And additionally, of course, the Supreme Court found in 2015's Obergefell versus Hodge decision that same-sex couples had a right to marriage, striking down, remember when we talked about DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Acts, which were laws prohibiting same-sex marriage. Civil rights today. We continue to be combating civil rights abuses. We continue to struggle to give equal recognition to people different from the template of kind of white Anglo-American Protestant civilization or culture. Affirmative action reflects the idea that the fact of past discrimination requires some kind of redress. Okay, so what is the appropriate level of judicial scrutiny in affirmative action cases? Again, there is contention surrounding the idea of strict scrutiny. When does affirmative action become reverse discrimination? There are now five Supreme Court cases that have addressed the issue of affirmative action in university admissions policies. The first was Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. This was in 1978, where the court upheld the constitutionality of affirmative action but struck down the University of California's admissions policies because they amounted to a specific racial quota. They basically said they were going to allow a certain percentage of their admissions into the medical school was going to be black and other minorities. Then in 2003, the court dealt with the University of Michigan's admissions policies, both for its undergraduate and law school. In Gratz versus Bollinger, the court struck down the university's undergraduate admissions policies because its race-based system of weighting admissions by race failed to address the individual worth of applicants and therefore amounted to a quota. However, in Grutter versus Bollinger, that was decided the same day, the court held that the university's law school admissions practices policies were more narrowly tailored, to consider the issue of race and were therefore constitutional. Not this past summer, but the summer before, the Supreme Court also handed down a decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And that dealt with, again, it was a challenge to Harvard University and the University of North Carolina's admissions policies. And the problem for a lot of, especially Asian Americans, is that they are adversely affected by affirmative action programs. Because Asian American communities place a much more weight on education because of their Confucian tradition that honors scholarship. Scholarship in those, among Asian Americans is much greater. This Students for Fair Admissions was actually what we might call an AstroTurf case. It was brought by a guy who is famously hostile to affirmative action. He has sponsored a number of cases. He is responsible for creating Students for Fair Admissions. And these were people who had been denied admissions to, pinnacle Ivy League schools. They nevertheless were at elite institutions. But they sued basically saying our civil rights were denied, and in effect, we were being subject to reverse discrimination. Chief Justice Roberts issued a majority opinion basically saying eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, in which he effectively conflated affirmative action with overt discrimination that prevented members of other minorities and women from being allowed into these elite institutions. Justice Ketanji Jackson basically issued a scathing dissent. Deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so. Immigration has become an enormously controversial issue. And again, whenever we have seen large waves of immigration of people that are not like us, we see this reaction, and a counter mobilization of social movements opposed to immigration. The Supreme Court has ruled that unauthorized immigrants have the same rights to medical care as any American, but they do not have rights, for example, to in-state tuition for higher education. Now, I think everybody agrees, or a large proportion of Americans, both liberal and conservative, agree that our immigration system is broken. The problem that we have is that our refugee laws have been abused and allowed large numbers of people to come into the country where they simply reside as sort of unauthorized, immigrants. Obama attempted to get immigration laws passed. Ultimately, in fact, the Senate passed a law that was fairly strict. Marco Rubio, a Republican senator from Florida, played a major role in getting that legislation passed in the Senate. But the House wouldn't even act on it. Similar thing happened recently, where again the Biden administration wanted more effective immigration policies. They encouraged Congress to pass legislation. Oklahoma Senator James Lankford took the lead in getting legislation proposed that again would have greatly expanded the number of Border Patrol agents. It would have expanded the number of immigration judges to more quickly adjudicate refugee claims. And it would have enabled the president to close the border if a certain number of daily encounters reached a certain point. Again, given that this wasn't an election year, Donald Trump told his House allies not to vote for the bill and basically killed it. And he killed it in the Senate as well because he wanted to run on the issue. He didn't want to resolve the issue at that particular point in time. Arab, Middle Eastern, and Muslim Americans have been, of course, subject to enormous kind of bouts of discrimination. Islamophobia is a byproduct of the September 11th, 2001 Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks. Discrimination against Muslim Americans has spiked during the war on terrorism. It spiked again after the horrible attacks by Hamas on Israelis, outside of Gaza. Contemporary protests, again, within the United States, both in support for Israel and in opposition to Israel's war against Gaza, have created, again, it's a wedge issue for Democrats because in many critical states, for example, in Michigan, there is a large Muslim population. Democrats have enjoyed an advantage because Muslim Americans have in recent years moved to support to support immigrant rights. And again, Jewish Americans are among the strongest supporters of the Democratic Party as well. So it is a very touchy issue in an election year, and it was part of the reason I think why Joe Biden's got out of the race, because a lot of young Americans did not like his unqualified support for Israel, and did not feel that he had done enough to restrain Israel in its war against Gaza, where upwards of 50,000 Gazans, many women and children, have been killed due to airstrikes and urban conflict. The criminal justice system, we are the world's leading jailer. We have 2.1 million incarcerated Americans in the United States. Most incarcerated Americans reside in state and local jails. The size of the prison population actually does not correlate with actual crime rates. In fact, crime rates have been going down in recent years. It oftentimes reflects a couple of different waves of things that happened. One, in the 1990s, you had a spike on crime, and you had the crime bill of the 1990s that was talking about super predators. The idea, three strikes laws, which basically if you commit 3 felonies, you're going to prison for life. That dramatically expanded the American prison population. You also, of course, had the war on drugs, which basically again criminalized, and I think illegal drug use is a problem. But it's more important to get at the people who are distributing the drugs than going after the people who are the consumers of drugs. Many of whom, again, are dealing with issues that if you intervene, they might be able to resolve their drug dependency issues. So the First Step Act represented, again, a bipartisan step towards meaningful reform. There has been widespread accusations of racial bias in policing, that many black Americans believe that the large number of incarcerated blacks reflect a determination of some states to use felony convictions to deny people the right to vote. And so again, that is another kind of problem. The racial justice movement, you have a long list of blacks who have been killed by police, oftentimes unarmed blacks. Even a partial list of the higher profile killings since 2014, including Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Stephon Clark, Breonna Taylor. The Washington Post has kept a database of police-involved killings since 2013, and among its findings include that black Americans are killed at a far higher rate, 6.2 per million per year, than non-Hispanic whites, 2.4 per million per year. Most people who are killed in interactions with police are between the ages of 20 and 40. Of the people in the Washington Post database, 20% were reported to have been suffering a mental health crisis, leading that led relatives to call for police, who subsequently killed them either by shooting them or in the act of restraining them, smothering them. Frustration over the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, it's one of those instances where there were lots of civil rights movements and marches and protests that occurred, from really the early 2000s forward. But that this nationalized the movement. And again, I mentioned in the previous presentation, the demographics of the Black Lives Movement was dramatically different, where it was not simply blacks and allied groups that were marching. There were large numbers of young whites that were members of those marchers. there continues to be controversy surrounding the racial justice movement. A lot of people, a lot of white Americans, tried to say blue lives matter, that there are too many cops killed. All lives matter, that we should respect all lives. And I agree that all lives should be respected. But at the same time, it's the fact that black lives disproportionately are not being respected, that blacks are being placed in positions where police feel justified to kill them, that is creating the problem. And so there's no need for us to be obtuse about that. This is a problem that we need to confront. So civil rights, what do you think? Many different groups of people have engaged in collective action through social movements to redress past injustices. As our nation increases in diversity, the need for equal protection laws becomes more essential to democracy than ever. Unfortunately, calls for redress of injustices have also led to counter movements calling for the return to an earlier era when discrimination in the name of upholding Anglo-Saxon Protestantism was considered not only acceptable but laudable. The history of civil rights struggles of disfavored groups also demonstrates that achieving justice takes time. As Theodore Baker was famously quoted, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice." I'm going to conclude that our discussion for today now, in part because I am losing my voice. I obviously have some allergy issues that I'm dealing with. And so when we return, we're going to pick up another very important issue that reflects on the idea of democracy, and that is the idea of public opinion. I'll see you next time.